Very much. That's a for those of you who are in the GTA, you will know that you've had access to a series of educational webinars since early 2021. And for this topic in particular, we're collaborating with the SSC as we share aims and objectives on the subject. And speaking of the subject, today's webinar is on biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, or BBNJ, and aims to, number one, explain what BBNJ is and how it could work, why it is needed for sustainable seafood, and to demonstrate alignment with the GTA and the SSC aims and objectives. And with regards to that, I'm going to hand over to Oliver, who's going to just go through, firstly, the SSC aims, then I will go over the GTA's aims on this subject.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just going to share my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Hello to the SSC members who I know, and to those GTA members who are not also SSC members. Great to meet you. My name is Oliver Tanqueray, and I'm the SSC coordinator, as Tom mentioned. And right now, I'm going to explain why the SSC is involved in this initiative, how paying some attention to BBNJ fits into the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve as an organization. And it's particularly nicely timed as we published our strategic plan earlier this week. So I'm going to focus this really around how this webinar and any follow-up activity to it fits into our strategic plan. First up, we have simplified our aims. So the SSC used to have 7 broad aims, and we had some member feedback last year as part of a survey. And one of the messages we got was that we need to be really clear and concise about what our role is within the wider sustainable seafood movement. Today, and the topics we're discussing today, is really going to be around our 4th aim, which is to influence changes in policy that are relevant to seafood sustainability. I'm going to leave it to our expert presenters to explain particularly why the BBNJ matters for sustainable seafood, but it is worth remembering that regardless of where your business is buying from, even if everything you catch, everything you source is from inshore fisheries, the high seas still really matter for that. We know these ecosystems are interconnected, and the way that we manage and have impacts on the high seas has implications for the entire ocean. And that can directly affect your supply chains and all the areas that you might be buying from. Collaboration is very much at the center of all of the aims and activities within our strategic plan. And as you can imagine, this is especially important when it comes to complex issues of policy reform. So the SSC plan involves collaborating with other initiatives both to avoid duplication of effort, but also to promote alignment in the global sustainable seafood movement. We intend to draw on the expertise of external organizations, which is exactly what we're doing today, to minimize this duplication, but also maximize the impact that we can have. So without deep in-house knowledge, either within Sustainable Seafood Coalition or Client Earth, we can still make sure we're making effective and targeted interventions by drawing on the wealth of knowledge that we have through external organizations. Finally, a note that we're going to defer to external expertise in knowing what is it useful for us as an industry to say about these issues, but it's still about coordinating joint advocacy activity between SSC members and also with GTA members. So you will be invited to shape the advocacy that we're conducting. We want this to be industry-led, but it's being informed by the best knowledge that we can get, which is what today's session is for. Finally, there are a couple of specific planned activities within our strategic plan that we're meeting partly by holding this discussion today. So we have output 4.1 within the plan, which is to make sure that members are informed and equipped to engage in relevant advocacy activities. This was another big message that we got as part of this members survey that I mentioned. SSC members made it clear that they want as much context and information as possible around any issues that they're invited to advocate for and to take a public position on. And that's really what today is all about. You should feel comfortable during this meeting to ask any questions that you have We're not going to assume any prior knowledge at all of BBNJ or the High Seas Treaty. And Nicola and Guillermo are really here to help us get a better understanding and feel confident about speaking publicly about this, if that's what we decide is right for us. There's also this specific activity of organizing a webinar on the High Seas Treaty and inviting sign-on to relevant interventions. We'll explain a bit more about the structure of how that's going to happen a little later. But I just wanted to reassure SSC members that we have specific terms of reference around how logos are used, how the SSC logo is used. I can give more information on that in the next session, but the short version is just to assure you no businesses' logos are going to be used publicly without explicit permission. We have processes to make sure that you're kind of comfortable and informed about what it is that you're signing up for. We're not looking for that sign on today, and really today is about sharing information and asking questions. So please enjoy this session. I'm really looking forward to it. And now I'm going to hand back to Tom so he can share the GTA's perspective.
Thanks very much, Oliver. So this is just a couple of slides just to sort of note why GTA is interested in the BBNJ. Next slide, please. So this is the GTA. This is the current membership. As you can see, it's retailers, suppliers and processors with an interest in tuna and tuna sustainability. Next slide, please. Importantly, though, it's the scale of these businesses. And the two things I just want to highlight here are in 2020, GTA Partners bought 1.27 million tons of tuna. That was worth about 1.3 billion US dollars. And how we operate is to try to utilize that commercial leverage to impact change. Next slide, please. And that's directly relevant because within our 5-year strategy, we call out the BBNJ. And you can see here, this is taken directly from our 5-year strategy. And one of our KPIs is for us to demonstrably advocate for a high seas treaty that addresses the current biodiversity and climate challenges beyond national jurisdiction. So this work and this presentation is highly relevant. So we will be using our commercial leverage to advocate for change around BBNJ. So this is why part one of this 2-part webinar is incredibly important to sort of set the scene. I think that's it, Oliver. Oh, no, there's one more. So yes, so what does this mean? We will support advocacy efforts initiated by others. This is an area we're not leading, we're not experts in, but we can support hence the relationship with Pew and the Stockholm Resilience Centre. We've also had discussions with WWF. These 2 webinars will introduce this topic to our partners. And the second webinar will explain how we can best use this commercial leverage to advocate for change. So that's that. And with that, as I noted, the second webinar will take place on Thursday, the 1st of July at 4 p.m. And it's going to demonstrate how the supply chain, i.e. you, can use your commercial leverage to advance the implementation of BBNJ, but it will also include the resources for advocacy that will be made available to you. So this is not that we're expecting you to go and do this on your own. So today's webinar is going to be co-presented by Dr. Guillermo Acherno Crespo from the Stockholm Resilience Centre and Nicola Clark from the Pew Charitable Trusts. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available along with the slides on the GTA website, and I will be sharing the links with Oliver, who can sort of directly share with SSC members as well. If I could ask you, if you haven't already, to keep your microphones on mute during the webinar to avoid any feedback issues or background noise, that would be much appreciated. We all want to hear from you. As Oliver said, there's plenty of time for questions at the end. Feel free to raise your hand, shout them out, use the chat box, anything that works for you. So that all being said, for those of you who have just joined us during the intros, welcome. And I'm delighted to introduce Nicola and Guillermo, with Nicola up first.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Let me just get my screen shared. All right, is everybody seeing the screen?
Yes.
Wonderful, great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to join you today to talk about the BBNJ negotiations. It's what I, along with my colleague Julian Jackson, spend our whole work lives following is the progress for these negotiations for the high seas. So before I get too much into the details of the treaty itself, I always think it's helpful to start out with a brief reminder of why we're doing this work in the first place, why the high seas matter, and why we need a treaty. So there was a time when the high seas were thought to be barren wastelands, the deserts of the ocean, but we know now, of course, that that's not true, that in fact the high seas are teeming with life. They represent 95% of habitable space on this planet, and they're home to millions of species, including highly migratory species and commercially important species. High seas fisheries account for up to 16 billion annually in gross catch. High seas also provide important ecosystem services, including oxygen provision and climate mitigation. Every other breath you take, you should thank the ocean. And estimates have put the economic value of carbon storage by the high seas between $74 and $222 billion per year. And then, of course, the high seas ecosystems are inextricably linked to domestic waters. What happens within the high seas, what happens within EEZs and domestic waters affects the high seas, and vice versa. And highly migratory species, including commercially important fisheries, are really exemplify this link. But that's more Guillermo's expertise, so I'll leave it to him to speak more about that. But the high seas are under threat from increasing human activities, both directly through overfishing, seabed mining, waste from shipping, pollution, and emerging threats from geoengineering and other emerging activities, as well as the other threats such as ocean acidification and climate change. So why a new high seas treaty? The core issue, the problem, as it were, is that there are several critical governance gaps on the high seas. A fragmented puzzle of organizations manage different aspects of human activities in different areas on the high seas with varying degrees of effectiveness. And they really don't do a great job of coordinating with each other. So in this messy patchwork approach to high seas governance, key things have slipped through the cracks. Namely, there's no legal mechanism to establish comprehensive marine protected areas on the high seas. And there's also no global obligation to conduct environmental impact assessments for activities taking place there. So this problem on the high seas is magnified by their vast scale. The high seas make up 2/3 of the ocean and cover almost half of the planet's surface. So on this map on the right there, all of those areas in dark blue space are the high seas. And then finally, I don't know how many of you have heard of this initiative to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030, but it's a protection target that scientists tell us we need to achieve if we want to maintain a healthy, functioning planet. And there have been several governments who have signed on to this goal as well. But it would be almost impossible to achieve a 30% ocean target without the high seas. And currently only about 1% of the high seas are protected. And almost all of that 1% comes from one MPA, the Ross Sea MPA in the Antarctic, which is a very special case, both legally and biologically speaking. So in case anyone needed a refresher on acronyms, I apologize, it is a bit of an alphabet soup. So if I ever start speaking in acronyms and I've lost anyone, please give me a shout and I'm happy to spell out the acronyms themselves. But BBNJ stands for Marine Biological Diversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And the BBNJ Treaty's core objective is the conservation and sustainable use of BBNJ. But also it's charged with considering a package of issues: marine genetic resources, area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. We won't have a high seas treaty until we've addressed all of these core topics. And then in addition to these sort of 4 elements of the package, there's also a variety of cross-cutting issues that are either found in sort of the general elements of the treaty or are issues that cut across all of the different package elements. So it's been a long and winding road to get to where we are today with the BBNJ Treaty. The United Nations has been talking about BBNJ for over 15 years now. In 2004, the UN decided to acknowledge that these high seas ocean areas might need a little more attention. There were some key issues that needed to be addressed. And in 2006, the UN first convened a meeting to talk about it, an ad hoc informal working group meeting to discuss BBNJ issues. They met about annually until 2015, when this ad hoc informal working group decided to launch preparatory committee meetings to decide whether or not they would have formal negotiations and a formal treaty. But the truly exciting moment came as an early Christmas gift in December of 2017, December 24th of 2017, when the UN adopted a resolution that formally launched negotiations for a high seas treaty. The fourth and final meeting of the negotiations was supposed to take place in March of 2020, but was postponed due to the pandemic. And it was again rescheduled to take place this August, but it has been just a couple of days ago postponed yet again until early 2022. Some key issues. I thought it might be helpful just to do a quick delve into each of these package issues so that you have a bit of a sense of what types of questions are being discussed. And not only that, but what an ambitious treaty would look like, because there are a lot of elements that are not guaranteed to be in the treaty. You know, they're key issues or key pieces of this agreement that are in bracketed text, so they're far from guaranteed to be included in the final text. And after 15 years plus of negotiating and talking about this issue, we want to make sure that the final treaty that we have is a robust one, an ambitious one, that actually makes a difference on the water and improves the status quo. So with regard to area-based management tools, some of the key questions that we've been discussing are definitions. How do you distinguish between marine protected areas and other more general area-based management tools? Cooperation and coordination. How will the BBNJ agreement enhance the work of existing organizations without undermining them? More on that later. Decision-making with regard to management measures. Should the BBNJ agreement be able to establish marine protected areas and associated management measures? So an ambitious treaty would create a legal process for the establishment and effective management and enforcement of a network of well-represented and connected MPAs. The treaty should also be giving authority to the Conference of Parties, which is the decision-making body, to establish these MPAs and other area-based management tools for conservation management, with a management plan and concrete measures to achieve those objectives. And then an ambitious treaty pending the establishment of MPAs and measures would also empower states to adopt interim and emergency measures. Moving on to environmental impact assessments. Key issues there really are what's going to be the threshold that would trigger a requirement for an environmental impact assessment. Two sort of schools of thought. One is to use the sort of threshold that we find currently in the law of the sea, which is significant harm. The other sort of school of thought is to use the more recent Madrid Protocol, which is what they use for the Antarctic. And the Madrid Protocol establishes a tiered approach. So different levels of requirements are required for different sort of thresholds are met, and the lowest threshold being more than a minor or transitory impact. Another key question for EIAs is with regards to decision-making. To what degree should decision-making on EIAs be internationalized, or should it be sort of taken on a case-by-case basis decided by states? And then a final key issue for environmental impact assessments is review and what that would look like. So an ambitious treaty would establish uniform, modern environmental assessments and consultation requirements for all proposed activities that have more than a minor or transitory effect on marine biodiversity and ABNJ. An ambitious treaty would also take an effects-based approach, which would require activities that may affect marine biodiversity and ABNJ, regardless of where the activity itself is taking place, to be assessed and managed. And certainly we see this with some new and emerging activities when nuclear waste is dumped, even if it's in domestic waters, we can expect that might eventually trickle its way into international waters and affect the biodiversity therein. And then, to ensure that the interests of the international community are represented, we would want to see review of EIAs by a scientific body that's established by the treaty, and would give the BBNJ treaty sort of review and decision-making authority over whether proposed activities may proceed, and if so, under what conditions. And then, similarly, it would look to provide that environmental impact assessments conducted by other organizations are consistent, so that we sort of have consistent standards, and we're sort of avoiding EIAs of convenience, as it were. And then marine genetic resource and capacity building are maybe slightly less relevant for this audience. So I've sort of condensed them into one slide, but so some key issues for marine genetic resources, the definition, what's included in the definition of marine genetic resources. Here you get into all sorts of fun Latin and sciencey terms like in situ, ex situ, sui generis. Should derivatives be included? Intellectual property rights, should that be dealt with in this treaty? And there's another forum that deals with international property rights. They're both sort of playing a game of, well, we don't need to deal with it, the other is dealing with it. Then a key question about should there be some sort of control over access to marine genetic resources? And if so, how? Should it be simply a notification system, or should there be stricter controls such as permitting and licensing? But the big question is whether or not there should be monetary and non-monetary benefit sharing, or if it should only be focused on the non-monetary benefit sharing. And then relatedly, whether any benefit sharing should be obligatory or voluntary. So really it comes down to which legal regime should apply, the common heritage of mankind or the freedom of the high seas. With capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, maybe a couple of minor questions, but really the key question on this element of the package is whether capacity building and marine technology transfer should be a mandatory element of the treaty, whether there would be hard and fast obligations for states, or whether this would be a voluntary aspect of the treaty. So an ambitious treaty would create a fair and equitable access and benefit sharing regime for marine genetic resources. And it would also have an effective funding mechanism to enable capacity building and the transfer of marine technology for implementing the agreement, particularly through support for ocean scientists, ocean sciences, monitoring, and other technologies. So then we get to cross-cutting issues, which I won't go into too much detail, but suffice to say that there are a number of cross-cutting issues to be considered. Institutional arrangements, the one I'm going to speak a little bit more on relationship to other instruments and international cooperation, question about not undermining. There's questions about how compliance and dispute settlement will be settled in the treaty, as well as others, principles, financing, entry into force, final clauses, etc. Now, why do we need to worry about the relationship with other instruments and undermining? So a quick overview of some of the many organizations that manage different aspects of the high seas. So you have at the very top the Convention on the Law of the Sea, we lovingly refer to as the Constitution for the Oceans. And within it has a couple of implementing agreements, including the Fish Stocks Agreement, which sort of sets up for regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, to manage fishing. I'm sure you're all very familiar with them. It also establishes that the International Maritime Organization should be the organization responsible for managing shipping. Another implementing agreement establishes an organization called the International Seabed Authority, which is charged with governing seabed mining in high seas areas. You also have the International Whaling Commission that manages whaling, CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which manages what it says, trade in endangered species, and a whole slew of others as well. You have United Nations Environment Program, which establishes some regional seas conventions, which don't have the authority to manage activities, but they do try and think about some sort of environmental conservation in the ocean, and many more that I don't have time to get into today, but I think you all get the point of this. So the BBNJ agreement is not going to be a supranational organization that sits on top of all of this, but instead it's going to have to fit in this sort of existing structure of ocean governance that we have for the high seas. And specifically, it would fit right here. It would be a third implementing agreement to UNCLOS. And now we have this sort of idea that these management organizations that we have, we should be trying to balance conservation and sustainable use in the high seas. But most of the organizations that we have out there are really focused on the sustainable use side of things, mining, shipping, and fishing, all on that sustainable use side of that's really their focus. Regional seas organizations are focused on conservation, but the challenges, and this is already an unbalanced scale, right? But the challenge is, you know, a number of these sustainable use organizations, they don't always do a great job of ensuring that that use is sustainable. Sometimes it's more just use. And then on the other side of the scale, I mentioned that regional seas organizations, while they do focus on conservation, they have no power to establish management measures or to govern human activity. So not a lot of teeth there. And then just to show a map, so what I've circled in red are the only areas where you even have a regional seas organization with some sort of mandate in the high seas. So it's not a very big area. And again, not a lot that can be done, especially when you're wanting to think about establishing comprehensive marine protected areas. There's a phrase within the UN resolution that launched the treaty, and it obliged negotiators to ensure that the BBNJ treaty shall not undermine existing organizations and instruments. It's a politically malleable term, which is why it was chosen. And different countries have come to interpret it very differently. And so on the one hand, you have those who sort of believe that not undermining should mean not overlapping. And they look at that map of existing organizations that we have, and they say, existing organizations are enough. We don't need any others. But then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those that interpret not undermining to mean not weakening, not undercutting, not making less effective. And those tend to feel that a new treaty is necessary to fill the governance gaps that we have. And an ambitious treaty would sort of take this approach. It would choose this interpretation, not undermining and specifically not undermining the effectiveness of. I won't speak more to that now because Guillermo is going to cover this more in his presentation. And really not undermining is a negative framing of this possible relationship between the BBNJ agreement and other organizations. I really think it's much more productive to frame this in the positive, the opportunities and with cooperation and coordination. Because this treaty really is an opportunity to improve and enhance the way we govern the high seas and their resources so that we can do so more effectively and efficiently. And a couple of ways that it could do this specifically. It could facilitate cooperation between overlapping and neighboring bodies. It could enhance science cooperation across organizations and institutions. We could share data and information so that the decisions that are being made with better data and they're being better informed by that latest information. It can also work on complementary measures to ensure that so that we can amplify, so that measures that are taken by one body or organization can be amplified and supported by measures that would complement that specific sort of management goal in other organizations. So you have a coherent and coordinated approach to management. And so you don't have different sectors working against each other. So for example, you could have coordination systems in place to prevent seabed mining plumes disseminating and decimating important breeding and nursery areas for fish stocks so that you ensure that seabed mining isn't going to be negative and detrimentally impacting fisheries. And really this agreement provides an opportunity, a really exciting once in a generation opportunity to provide cross-sectoral cumulative impact perspective, which is something that we really need in this day and age to ensure that we're most effectively managing and using the resources that we have on the high seas. I'm going to leave it there for now, and thank you very much for your attention and turn it over to Dr. Ortuno Crespo. Thanks very much.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Nicola, and thanks a lot to both SSC and GTA for creating this space of dialogue. I think that the seafood retail sector can play a very meaningful role in this long journey that, as Nicola said, has been going on for way over a decade and will essentially determine how we perceive and protect half of our planet. So I think it's a really important treaty of the UN that has been evolving in the background, that has not gained a lot of attention, but that is, I think, very important for the well-being of coastal nations and coastal economies. So in my 15 minutes, I'm going to be exploring what I consider to be one of the biggest elephants in the room the BBNJ, which is the nexus between the treaty and some of the provisions of the treaty and commercial fisheries in areas beyond national jurisdiction that have been expanding further and deeper into the open ocean for the last 70 years or so. So when I was thinking about how to start these slides, I thought it would be nice to take a step back and talk about actually what is biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, or what do we know about it? Because we have this whole treaty that is evolving, that is talking about EIAs and area-based management tools, but what species are out there was a question that some colleagues and I realized a few years ago that wasn't being addressed properly. The map you're seeing on your screen is a spatial representation of the data housed in OBIS. OBIS used to be called the Ocean Biogeographic Information System. It is now the Ocean Biodiversity Information System. And it is essentially a database hosted by UNESCO, where all nations can contribute whatever data they may have on species in international waters. You know, at a first glance, if you look at this map, it seems like we're doing a good job. The geographic coverage of data looks pretty global. But then if you take a closer look at the legend in the bottom of your screens, you will notice that any pixel that is in white means that there's no data, and any light blue or dark blue pixel has 10 or less records in the historic series. And a friendly reminder that this database started in the late 1800s. So anything in blue is an area where for the last 120, 130 years, we've recorded less than 10 species records, so not that much. Another thing that is worth pointing out is that each pixel is 100 by 100 kilometer cells. So what originally looked like a very comprehensive coverage of biodiversity knowledge quickly boils down to a couple hotspots in the ocean where we have a lot of data and the rest is fairly data deficient. If we look at it from a taxonomic perspective, so what species have we recorded, the first sort of impression is fairly good. We have recorded 27,000 species in the high seas. We know that there are about 2 million in the global ocean, but it's a fairly good starting point for the implementation of a treaty. But as you know, to implement any fisheries or mining or shipping management measure that is science-based, we need a lot of data or substantial amounts of data. So we asked the question, how many of these 27,000 species have 10 or more records? We immediately lose 20,000. And the more data that you ask for, the fewer species we have. We're actually updating the study, and we find that species with over 1,000 records, which isn't that much in the fisheries context, boils down to just 371 species out of those initial 27,000. So we're working to develop a treaty in a very data deficient space. To help illustrate this, I'm going to be focusing quickly on Pisces. So those are primarily your bony fish, but some also your cartilaginous fish. We have recorded 4,052 species over the last century in the high seas. Now, from your screens, you'll be able to notice immediately that we've only been able to collect records in OBIS for the Western Central Atlantic, and the rest of the globe remains pretty data deficient. The numbers on the top tell us a different story about the data richness for these 4,000 species. So only 1,000 species, so about a quarter, have more than 10 records. And almost half of them only have one record. So we know they're out there, but we don't have enough information about their biology and their ecology to understand what to do next and how to protect them effectively. If we park that for a second, and then we look at what humans have been up to in the open ocean, these are two figures from a paper that came out a few years ago. The figure on the left shows the tremendous expansion of ocean industries into the open ocean, non-extractive industries primarily. So you'll see how submarine cable capacity has increased exponentially since the year 2000, how more nations are putting out their ships for maritime trade, and how deep sea mining claims to the International Seabed Authority have also increased quite a bit over the last few years. What I think is more shocking, more impressive even, is the increase in fishing effort, the dark blue on the figure on your right, that we've seen since the 1980s. Fishing effort has increased almost exponentially in the high seas. But if you look at the light blue, the landings, they sort of stagnated in the middle of the 90s, similar to wild captures at a global level, according to FAO. So we're fishing harder. These two lines in the bottom show us that we're fishing for pelagic species and benthic species deeper, but we're not necessarily catching more. Apologies for the poor resolution of this animation. This shows us that the expansion has also been horizontal. Since the 1960s, in this particular case, we've been fishing for sharks further and further from shore across all tropical and temporal latitudes. So we'll get to sharks in a little bit more detail further on, but just to show you that the last few decades, we've seen a radical transformation in terms of how we fish, from fishing continental shelves and coastal oceans to really venturing really far into the high seas. This slide is very text heavy, so I'm just going to walk you through it as best I can. But essentially, over the last 3 to 4 decades, scientists have been able to start mapping some of the impacts that commercial fisheries may be having on target and non-target species, if not properly managed. Commercial fisheries have been identified by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, as the main driver of decline for many target species. And they estimate that if you're a straddling or migratory fish stock, so if you cross more than one jurisdictional boundaries and you spend some time in the high seas, you have twice the odds of being overfished or experiencing overfishing than a fish that is found within domestic waters. They also determined that fisheries bycatch was the main driver of decline of 22 species of all 22 species of albatross and most oceanic elasmobranchs, so your sharks and rays, which are now near threatened, at least near threatened in the IUCN Red List, which is an international repository of species endangerment. In addition to declines in abundance, as these abundances decline, we've seen contractions in species ranges. You're removing the adults that are more physiologically capable, so the ranges have begun contracting for some species. We've also monitored changes in body mass. Fish and other species, sharks, are getting smaller. And by removing the adults, we're also reducing the fecundity and the growth rate of the populations. As you all know, the large adult females are the most fecund, they produce the most eggs. And if we remove those, we sort of hamper the ability of some of these populations to come back in numbers. If we take a bit of a step back ecologically and we look at the biological communities and ecosystems in the open ocean, almost 20 years ago, we already started detecting evidence of trophic cascades. And if you haven't heard that term previously, it's an ecological term for when you remove the top of the food chain, so those lions in the savannah, and you see an increase in the abundance of whatever the lions were eating. And then that expansion of the grazers has knock-on effects throughout the food web. So it's not a matter of assessing the impacts on whatever you're fishing, but understanding how that may propagate throughout the food web. Another paper that was published a long time ago was already recording reductions in open ocean predator biodiversity in every single ocean basin that range from 10 to 15%. And it correlated with fishing pressure much more so than with climate change or any atmospheric pattern. So as Nicola mentioned, the United Nations 25 years ago put together what we now call the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. It was the second implementing agreement under the law of the sea. And as an ecologist, I think it's fairly well written. It recognizes that species are related to one another, whether they're a target or non-target. And it sort of promotes, without saying it explicitly, but it promotes an ecosystem approach to monitoring and managing fisheries impacts. These are some articles from the Fish Stocks Agreement, which essentially call on nations and RFMOs to acknowledge and study the connectivity of species across jurisdictional boundaries. So if there's a fish in the UK, it might swim down to Spain and then cross over to the Americas. And that requires that those parties, those nations and those fisheries communicate in order to jointly manage the stock. I think the most important part of the Fish Stocks Agreement as it pertains to today's conversation is this other article that talks about the need to assess the impacts of fishing on non-target and associated or dependent species or species belonging to the same ecosystem, which comes to say it is not good enough to just focus on target species that you're harvesting. You have to understand how you're impacting other non-target biodiversity. So could RFMOs become vehicles for biodiversity conservation? And this is where things get tricky with BBNJ, and this is where we need a more meaningful conversation from my perspective. As Nicola said, states have committed to not undermine relevant existing legal instruments, bodies, and frameworks, which means that the BBNJ Treaty should not undermine deep sea mining authorities, shipping authorities, or fishing authorities, which I see as a good thing. We should avoid redundancy and save resources for other things. But like Nicola also mentioned, some actors have used this, have misused interpretation of the term to argue that the new treaty should not deal with any types of impacts by these other sectoral activities. So I think personally that RFMOs should have unique competence for establishing catch limits for target species, and they have the potential of being the main vehicle for monitoring non-target and associated or dependent species. However, they don't do a good job at identifying which species these are, and that's where things get murky, where a lot of species remain unmonitored and RFMOs are not stepping up their game. We've heard some parties at BBNJ go as far as saying that anything that is a fish, so those 4,052 species that you saw a few slides ago, should be left out of the agreement just because they are fish and we already have regional fisheries management bodies. So I'll get to that point in a few slides. I think that perhaps we should only consider excluding certain species if there's evidence that existing bodies, RFMOs and others, are already monitoring them. So we take a look at the RFMO framework that we've established over the last few decades. You'll realize that the 5 tuna RFMOs that are out there provide pretty good geographic or spatial coverage of the main tropical and temperate latitudes for tuna and tuna-like species. So from a spatial perspective, I think they provide sufficient coverage. Here on the right, you see the geographic distribution of non-tuna RFMOs, which remains extremely patchy. So the Eastern Tropical Pacific, the Central and Southwest Atlantic, and the Eastern Indian Ocean still don't have an authority that oversees fisheries in the high seas in 2021. So any fishing that is happening here, let's say off the coast of Argentina, for squid in this case, is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So the question that isn't being addressed at BBNJ right now is, how will the treaty be implemented in these areas of the global ocean where there's no RFMO that can be undermined? And that question still remains unaddressed, and it's one that it would be, I think as an ecologist, it would be fantastic to hear from RFMOs more and from industry more about these sort of governance gaps that are going to cause trouble further down the line. To give you a very brief example of what RFMOs have been up to, they have established some spatial management over the years, but these remain focused on target species, they're poorly enforced, and they're all static. These are examples from for pelagic fisheries, so it doesn't include the benthic closures for non-tuna RFMOs. But these static boxes don't do a good job at protecting highly mobile species. Another aspect of where I think tuna RFMOs are falling short in terms of monitoring impacts is that they do not request that longliners, pelagic and drifting longliners, have observer coverage rates above 5%. So less than 5% of the global longline fleet is monitored. We're not collecting meaningful data. And if you work with a data set that only covers 5% of whatever sector, the scientific results might be skewed and erroneous. So we have to watch out and call for larger, more comprehensive monitoring. Just being mindful of time, I think I have like 3 slides left. So I think this is the question that needs to be discussed in more detail at BBNJ, which pertains to taxonomic gaps in RFMOs. So even though they have this mandate from the Fish Stocks Agreement to assess impacts on non-target species of those belonging to the same ecosystem, in the case of sharks, that would include sharks for tuna RFMOs. A recent study in Nature estimated that over the last 5 decades, we've lost 71% of all oceanic sharks. So you might ask the question, well, what are tuna RFMOs doing to monitor and manage these non-target species that they have been responsible for taking care of since the 1950s? If you look at ICAT in the North and South Atlantic Ocean, to bring things to perspective, just in the Atlantic waters of the United States, there are 43 species of shark. And since 1969, when ICAT was established, they have only conducted stock assessments on 3 species of shark. In the case of the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, it is known that up to 55 species of shark are caught within the convention area. IOTC has only been around for 24 years, so not as much as ICAT, and they have only conducted one stock assessment for pelagic sharks without any catch limits. In fact, most oceanic sharks around the globe don't have any type of catch or mortality limits. 2 years ago, we published a study that focused on those 4,052 fish species that are found in the high seas. And we asked the question, how many of these species that are known to occur in the high seas have a stock assessment or some other type of population assessment? And if the number is high, if a vast majority of those 4,000 species are being somewhat monitored, then maybe fishing nations and RFMOs are doing a good job at dealing with fish, and maybe the new agreement should not deal with fish. But what we found was quite the opposite. Less than 5% of those fish species have a scientific population assessment. So we basically have no information on the relative abundance of 95% of the fish biodiversity in the high seas. So we don't know how climate change or fishing or shipping or mining may be affecting these species. So just to wrap up, I think there is an urgent need to harmonize BBNJ and the fish stocks agreement and RFMO mandates. It would be very helpful for RFMOs to show up at the BBNJ negotiations in larger numbers. I think I've only seen 3 ever show up. Many nations are still arguing that fish should not be included in the scope of the treaty, which, as you've seen from the last few slides, perhaps may not make a lot of sense. The implementation of the BBNJ treaty in areas where we'd have no RFMO remains unresolved. RFMOs are not monitoring or managing much of the biodiversity they are impacting through commercial fishing activity. And if fish are not included, targeted and non-targeted fish, then we open the possibility for other sectors to have an impact on these species that you may care about. And because fish were not included, we cannot monitor the trajectories and inform what the best management practices may be. And this is my personal opinion. I think that the seafood retail sector has immense leverage on the level of management, transparency, and enforcement ambition and standards that both BBNJ and RFMOs can set. And I think that consolidating a joint position on this topic would be a unique opportunity for the sector to influence what may be the most transcendental treaty for the ocean in 40 years. So with that, I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to any potential questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Great introduction to the subject there. Lots of information. We have 10 minutes for questions, which is good. We've already got one question. Just before I read out that question, if you have any questions, please feel free to put your hand up, shout out, or use the chat box. The first question is, it seems that there have been factions debating the details of the High Seas Treaty for years. Would our voice make a difference? And who else is already advocating for a robust treaty? Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to start out, but then Guillermo's also been to a number of the negotiations, so feel free to chime on and add in. So there are certainly a lot of players who do come to sort of the observer section of the treaties. So of course we've got my own organization, Pew Charitable Trust, is there as part of the coalition of other nonprofit organizations that participate as part of the High Seas Alliance. That's probably the biggest sort of conglomerate of nonprofits that are there advocating for an ambitious treaty. You do also have a couple of academics who go to observe. And then, as Guillermo mentioned, there were a number of, a handful, three-ish or so regional fisheries management organizations, their secretariats who showed up to observe and make statements. And I'll also say, I think there has been occasionally a comment that the importance of ensuring that a diversity of voices are represented during the negotiations, and the business and sort of commercial industry has been pretty lacking as a voice that's taking part of that negotiations. Cable laying industry is there. They show up and chat and make interventions. So anyway, I think that certainly delegates, negotiators would be really keen to hear from other interests, including sort of from your own commercial interests as well. So I think that's definitely a gap in terms of voices that are at the table, and one that I think would be well received. Guillermo, what do you think?
Absolutely. I have been attending for a few years, and a lot of colleagues have been attending from sort of the science side of things. And to be very honest, we're not listened to all that much. I have a feeling that if GTA and SSC were to show up and show interest in this topic, a lot of the nations that are skeptical about including fish and fisheries impacts could reconsider their position. And I think it's important to remember that what Oliver said earlier and what Nicola said earlier, the high seas are connected to your coastal fisheries, to your coastal communities, to your coastal peoples. And right now we have a handful of nations that have been fishing out there for the last 7 decades, causing a lot of harm and making it very difficult for any conservation and sustainable management to happen. So part of the reason why I reached out to Tom and Oliver was because I think that your organizations, if you were to show up, you would be listened to, and you could have and do a lot of good for this process, not to restrict fishing, but to make sure that we continue generating knowledge to inform fisheries management. Because as you saw from my slides, a lot of areas of the high seas that are being actively fished are data deficient because no data from that sector is being shared. So another consideration is that we have this sort of looming threat in the background, climate change, that will over time change a lot of the distribution and ecology of the species that we care about, commercially and non-commercially. And we have to start collecting more meaningful data for those species to try to predict where they might go in the future. So if right now we off the bat say, well, fish are off the tree because we created RFMOs, I think that would be a mistake. And when we say to scientists, when we raise the issue, we're not listened to, but I have a feeling that you would be.
Thank you very much. I've had a question come through on the private chat, just saying what resources are available and how can we get involved? That's a super question, and it's one that totally preempts the second webinar. So I would suggest we hang on to that one until we reconvene on the 1st of July. Any questions from anyone? I saw Helena pop up. Ah, Helena, there you are.
Hi, yes, thank you both for the presentation. So I'm work for Tesco, I think I've met you before, but so very keen to support, because when we did some digging into this, we saw that there wasn't any market voice or industry voice overall supporting the initiative. So I think definitely that any business support for this will help move the treaty forward. But the only thing that I'm missing from the presentations, and maybe we can pick up next time we reconvene, or you can send some stuff via email, is a bit more details on what actually the treaty or the proposed treaty is going to cover and how much is going to be affected, and any research on if it has been done around business impacts on, you know, how currently things are happening. Because I think most of the businesses that are here on the call today, for example, would not be only affected as we currently work on fisheries, but also on the transportation side of things, on the maritime side of the treaty, because we do use boats to ship around or goods. So it'll be good to kind of to get a bit more information on that. But overall, I'm very keen to have an overarching umbrella that gives us an extra framework for us to refer to and try to drive change and progress. So yeah, thank you for today.
Thank you very much, Helena. And I think that's something that we can certainly look at, including on the next webinar. Any other questions from our audience? No. Well, I very much hope that this has been a good sort of foundation for the BBNJ and really sort of setting out why it's important to both GTA and SSC. The second webinar, like I say, 1st of July, is very much going to be about what can actually be done by members of the supply chain. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting webinar in terms of tangible steps forward. So what I would like to do is thank you all very much for joining our joint webinar. Special thank you to Nicola and Guillermo for presenting. If you do have any feedback or any questions that come to mind afterwards, please do not hesitate to contact me or Oliver, and we're happy to sort of convene that. The second part of this webinar will take place on Thursday, the 1st of July at 4 p.m. BST. It will be recorded as well, just in case you have any difficulty in attending that one. And like I said at the start, the slides and the recording will be uploaded to the GTA website. So as the final point, thank you so much for attending. Thank you for our speakers, and wish you all a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. Bye.